So thank you for coming, and this is our second walking tour of the season, and this one is on the business people and merchants, and the last time was on the early immigrants and settlers, and some of you maybe know that we're being videotaped, and so that last tour is already up on the village's YouTube channel, and so just check that out, or do a search for McFarland Cable. Just go to YouTube, do McFarland Cable YouTube cemetery tour, and it should show up. This seems to be going in and out. Are we okay? Yep. All right. So we're going to start with some of the early business people in town, and McFarland had kind of a, I wouldn't call it a renaissance, but a growth spurt in the late 19th century, early 20th century when it came to businesses. The 1890s saw a lot of building in what was our little downtown, and a lot of the wooden frame buildings were changed over to brick, and so some of the brick buildings that you see today were built in the 1890s. And then into the 20th century, the first decade or two, more businesses came, and the people who ran those businesses were really critical to the growth and development of our little village. We're going to start with Cora and Arn Thompson. They weren't some of the early ones, but they had an impact on McFarland. And we have Cora Thompson right over here, and Arn Thompson right behind her. And they both were born in this area. Both of their sets of parents immigrated from Norway, and they were members of the McFarland Lutheran Church. They grew up here, went to school here. I don't know for sure exactly where they went to school. They could have gone to McFarland, they could have gone to the school on Sickleco, or they could have gone to Door Creek. I just don't know, but Arn and Cora knew each other growing up. And the interesting thing is, Cora's maiden name was Thompson, and she married a Thompson. So that was handy for her. But Arn was in the garage business, and he was a partner with Bert Autumn. And they had a garage on Main Street where the library is located right now. It's on the corner of Main and Long Streets. And he and Bert Autumn had this garage business where they repaired automobiles, and they opened in around 1916, so there weren't that many cars in McFarland in 1916. I think the first one appeared in town in 1909, but they were on the ground floor of this fledgling business of repairing cars, and they also had a Ford dealership in downtown McFarland. No one today, I'm sure, can imagine having a car dealership where the library is located right now, but that's what they were doing. But the business went for 20 years until Arn died in 1936. And the problem was that he was quite in debt. And so the business didn't go on. They had to close it, and Bert Autumn and Cora Thompson had to have an auction, a public auction, to sell off a lot of the items in their garage to pay off the debts. And but Cora continued staying in McFarland, and she was the postmaster, or I guess in those days the postmistress. But she started, I think, in the building which is now the McFarland Tavern. That was the Evans store, and then it later became the Smedal store, and that's where it was first the postmaster in McFarland. And then she moved across the street to the Tolliff Lewis building, which some of you know as the Lofgren dentist office. And from there she moved across the street. There was a building where I think Cora actually owned it, and she moved the post office in there. But then in 1960, she moved to the McFarland's first standalone post office building, which is on Long Street behind Spartan Pizza on Long Street. It's a one-story light brick building. That's where McFarland's post office was, starting in 1960. And soon after that, Cora retired. But she, I believe, was McFarland's longest serving postmaster. She served for 36 years. But early in her career, Cora was a school teacher, and she taught in all sorts of places. She taught in McFarland. She taught at the Daily School, which is out on Deerson Road, or used to be on Deerson Road. She taught in DeForest, and she went all the way to South Dakota to do some teaching. But she came back to McFarland, and then when she married Arn, she retired from her teaching. And she died in Texas, where she retired, where she had a child living there, and so she died there in 1988. So, all right, so now we'll head over to the corner of the cemetery, and again, please watch your step. All right, our next stop is the Evans brothers, and their parents, Even and Margaret Eggleston. And here you have a large monument with the Evans name on it, but then you see Even Eggleston and Margaret Eggleston. They were the parents. They and their children immigrated from Norway, and they came to the McFarland area, and they had a farm in the town of Dunn. It's an unusual last name, Eggleston, but one of the sons, his first name is Egil Evans. And when you see a name like Eggleston, that means Even Eggleston. Even's father was also an Egil, and so Even was Egil's son, just like someone down my ancestry was Lars's son. But so Even Eggleston, and that's why they named one of their children Egil after, the father of Evans. But they came to the United States, and one of their sons was Ole, like many Norwegians, Ole Evans, and he didn't want to farm. He thought he'd go into business. And so in 1889, he went into business with Ole S. Olson, who had a shop on Main Street. And Ole Evans learned quite a bit, and so he thought he could go into business on his own. But he got his brother Egil to join him, so it was the Evans brothers who started a business. And so where the tavern is, that building was built by Ole and Egil Evans for their general store, and that was 1895. And they were selling anything that you could want. And at that time in McFarland, there were 5 general stores. And you think in a population of 200 to 300 in this area, that'd be too many stores. But they all managed, and they all made a living. But Ole was the main person in the shop, and his brother Egil died in 1912, and so Ole, rather than just going on his own, he recruited his brother-in-law Harold Smedal to join him in the business, and Harold married Ole's and Egil's sister, Asna, and so Harold was happy. A week after Egil died, Harold joined the company and continued the business. Ole was very interested in politics, and so I think he needed a partner to run the store while Ole did his things with politics. He was on the Town of Dunn board. He was a good friend of Fighting Bob La Follette, and La Follette would often come to McFarland and give his stump speeches in front of the Evans store. And sometimes in the cold weather, they'd go upstairs in the Evans Hall, as they called it, and he would have his speeches there. And Ole was quite the progressive politician and supporter. And of course, then that fits well with Fighting Bob La Follette. But then Ole thought he should retire. In 1918, he retired, but he had just been elected chairman of the town of Dunn. So he focused all of his energies on running the town of Dunn. One thing about Ole, he never married, didn't have a family, but I think he really was involved in all of McFarland's policies in the town of Dunn. At that time, McFarland was a part of the town of Dunn. McFarland didn't incorporate until 1920, and so when McFarland incorporated, Ole became a trustee in the village, and gave up his town position. One interesting thing here, you might see, you have Ole Evans that we're talking about, and then you have Ole E. Evans. So there are two Oles. And the story behind that, when they were still in Norway, Ole was very sick. So sick that they brought in a doctor to try to save him. And the doctor was looking at him and trying to figure things out, and he came back out to the parents and said, "There's nothing I can do, just expect to bury him, he's going to die soon." And at that moment, Ole's mother, Margit, was 9 months pregnant, ready to have a baby. And right then, when she was getting this bad news, she was in labor, and so the new baby was born, and it was a boy. And the tradition in Norway, and maybe some other cultures, if you have a child born and you had another child before that die, you would name that newborn child the same name. And so they figured Ole was going to die, so they named the new baby Ole to go along with the tradition. But miraculously, Ole lived. And so they had to figure something out, so they went by Ole and Ole E. They didn't decide to change the name of the newborn. They had the two Oles. And when they were growing up, one was the big Ole and one was little Ole. And when he got old enough, Ole E, when he could grow a mustache, he thought he would have a mustache, and so he was referred to as Mustache Ole to make the difference between the two. But I should just read one little thing about Ole Evans when he retired. And he passed his share of the business on to Harold Smedall. And on his retirement, the Capital Times wrote, "In these history-making days," or remember it's 1918, "in these history-making days, the doings of the average country shopkeeper claim but little attention. About 7 miles from the Capitol Dome in the little village of McFarland, Ole Evans has retired from business. We believe that Ole Evans's retirement is entitled to a little space even in these hurly-burly days of war. For 28 years, Mr. Evans has attended to the wants of the good people of McFarland and vicinity. His customers were his friends. His honesty and genial nature brought the confidence of his neighbors. He has been honored in both a business and political way by his fellow citizens in the town of Dunn. May he enjoy many years of quiet comfort and pleasure with the people who have learned to love him, is the wish of the Capital Times to Mr. Evans." So, quite nice. All right, now we're just going to go a short distance up this way.
Some are Eagleson and some are Evans.
Yeah,
Same family,
it's the same family. I guess I should try to explain that. Egilson was their name when they came
from Norway.
from Norway. For some reason, the children, well, usually in tradition, they don't take the Egilson name because they're not the son of Egil, but they are the son of Even. But they didn't go by Evenson. For some reason, they dropped the O-N and just went by Evans.
Oh, so that's where the Evans came from then, rather than
Yeah.
Evenson.
Yeah,
Okay.
from their father's first name.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for,
Thank you.
yeah. All right, well, the next business person we're going to talk about is Lewis Harrison. And he was born in 1863 in the McFarland area. And he, in his adult life, was a general contractor and carpenter. And he built a lot of the homes in the McFarland area. But the one thing that he's best known for building is the old Wabisa School on Sigelco Road. He built that in 1920. and he was even on the school board for the Wabisa School for a while. One of the homes that he built is a bungalow-style house on Wisconsin Street. If you know Glenn and Meg Nielsen, it's that house where they live. He built that home. And there's a twin sister home on Exchange Street, another bungalow where Alice and Erling Olson lived, and before that Bert and Cecilia Autumn lived. That was built by Lewis's brother Albert. And so they were in business together, and they had the same access to the same house plans when they would do their building. Lewis was a member of the McFarland Lutheran Church. But besides the Wabisa School, the other major thing that Lewis built that everybody in McFarland knew about was the Edwards Park Pavilion, or the dance hall. And that was built in 1912, before the Wabisa School. But before I go into the dance hall, I should also say about the Wabisa School. It says a lot about Lewis's craftsmanship, but it's on the National Register of Historic Places, so that's quite nice. And a couple of his houses are on McFarland's local landmarks, historic places too. But going back to the dance hall, being built in 1912, he and his brother Albert and Lewis's son Oscar built that. And then 2 years later, they purchased the Edwards Park store. And for some reason, though, that fall in 1914, Lewis had doubts if that was the right thing to do. There was an ad in the Capital Times that fall that Lewis placed wanting to sell or trade his Edwards Park properties for some income property in Madison. And he said he wanted to focus all of his attention back on his contracting and carpenter days. But he never got a reply, or one that he liked, because he didn't sell them or trade them in. He kept them, but he was obviously didn't really have his heart in the business. So he found two men from Stoughton, Carl Holm and Emil Olson, to run the business for him, especially the dance hall. And so those two gentlemen from Stoughton took over the business. They didn't own it. Lewis still owned it, but it freed him up to do his carpentry work. And so the two men from Stoughton did the scheduling of the dance hall and brought in the bands and orchestras for the weekly dances. But in 1921, Oscar, Lewis's son, showed an interest in the business, so Lewis sold the Edwards Park store and the dance hall to his son Oscar. And so Oscar and his wife Jane ran it for a number of years. But they would also bring in somebody that would help out with the scheduling of the dance hall and bringing in the bands, because that was a really major chore to do. But then in 1937, Oscar and Jane's daughter Genevieve and her husband Glenn Brandt took over the store operation, and they ran it until 1942. And it was under their tenure is when some sad news happened, that the dance hall that Lewis built burned to the ground. And so that was a very tragic thing in Harrison's life, but they quickly rebounded, and by May of 1941 they had rebuilt the dance hall. And that's the building that's still standing down in Edwards Park. It's kind of hidden because it was a building was put in front of it a lot of you know as the 5100 Club was attached to the old dance pavilion. But in 1942, another daughter, Florence, and her husband Wilfred Brandt ran the operation until 1953. And unfortunately, another tragedy took place where Wilfred died in a boating accident. He fell overboard, and the boat was out of control and left him, and he was all alone in the boat, and he was about 300 yards from shore, and he drowned. And so after that, Florence didn't want to have the, run it by herself, so her sister came back and ran it with her husband. But the Harrison family finally sold the dance pavilion and the store in 1960 to the Halverson family. But for many years, from 1912 to 1960, it was a major part of the Harrison family and a huge part of, and colorful part of McFarland's history. But one interesting thing about the dance hall that Lewis Harrison built, it was one of the largest dance halls in Dane County. It had a dance floor space of 50 feet by 80 feet with extra space for a balcony and extra space for a large orchestra. So it was a quite amazing place. And I've got a photo. At the top is the original dance hall that Lewis built, and at the bottom is the dance hall that opened in 1941. The one on top is the original. And then this is the Edwards Park store. This photo was taken in 1960 when the Harrisons sold it to the Halversons. And that's still standing, and if you would drive by there or walk by there or ride your bike, it's still there. I think it's the Park Pub? Park Bar. Yeah. Parkside Pub. Thank you. But I'm sure some of you have some good stories about being at the dances. Anybody want to share a story?
I'll share one story. The girls sat all on one side and the guys sat all on the other side. And the bands were always really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, during Pat's time, when she'd go to the dance hall, the girls sat on one side and the boys sat on another side. It sounds like the gymnasium in high school.
Very much.
All right, we'll continue up this way.
Where is Edwards Park?
Down towards Lake Wabisa. It's
Isn't that Brant Park?
the baseball diamonds, Brant Park. The Brants ran the Edwards Park store and the dance hall. But just across the railroad tracks, all of that property, the Green Lantern, and all those homes and the 5100 Club area, that's all Edwards Park.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Does any of it still called Edwards Park? Because it gives McDaniel's at the end, right?
Yeah, the neighborhood is still Edwards Park.
I see.
Yeah.
There's no actual Edwards Park.
There's no park. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But I guess I should give a little background to Edwards Park and the resorts. I'm going to be talking about the resorts in just a minute, but the resorts were a big deal in McFarland at the turn of the century, early 1900s, going for decades, and people from Illinois, Rockford, Chicago, Freeport would come up. They would have cottages on the lake, and they'd come up for the summertime, stay the whole summer. Maybe the husband of that family was a big shot in Chicago, and the rest of the family would come up to the cottage in the summer. And then when the train trestle was raised, it allowed boats to come through, and so a lot of the cottages after that time were owned by Madison people, and they would come to Edwards Park or somewhere else along the lake. There are numerous, what do you call, parks, Crescent Park, bars, Larson's Beach, all along the shore of Lake Wabisa. And Edwards Park was not a part of McFarland until 1955 when McFarland annexed it at the request of the people who lived there. It was part of Blooming Grove, and then so since '55, it's been part of the village. But before that, students there some would go to school in McFarland, some would go to Wabisa and Sigilco. So now we're going to talk about Gilbert Johnson. And this is his headstone here. It says G.L. Johnson and his wife Christy. He was born in Norway and came to this country with his parents and brothers. And I don't know a whole lot about his early life or where he settled, but I believe they settled in Blooming Grove. The earliest evidence I have of that is an article where in 1894 Gilbert was in the paper because he was raising tobacco, and it's just a two-line sentence, and Gilbert Johnson's raising 5 acres of tobacco. But in 1891 there's an article where just one line that said he rented the Flom Hotel in Madison, and it doesn't say what for or for how long, but the Flom Hotel was on East Main Street, about 3 blocks off of the square, and so Gilbert was doing that. But the best evidence we have was in 1896 in a State Journal article reported that Gilbert and his brother Andrew were going to start a butcher shop in McFarland, and it said that Andrew would manage the shop while Gilbert would traverse the country buying stock. And where I believe that butcher shop was located is in what was known as the Johnson and Scary building, and it's where the Spartan Pizza is located right now. I don't know how long he stayed there either. It's a really mystery about not only Gilbert Johnson but also that building. I don't know when that building was constructed, but a lot of people went in and out. A lot of different businesses were in and out of there, but it seemed like there was always a meat market in that building, and Gilbert Johnson was one of the proprietors of that meat market. And he had 3 children. I guess he had more than 3 children, but 3 of his children and Gilbert and his wife moved from McFarland in 1912 and went to Cottage Grove and for a while, and then eventually went to River Falls. But before they moved, they had a couple tragedies. He had a young son, Martin, who was born in 1891 and died in 1904. And Martin, like a lot of his friends during that time, they would play around the railroad tracks. And they had a special game where they would, as a train came in or leaving, they would jump on and jump off. And the story is that Martin was trying it. He was jumping on, but he was wearing a longer overcoat. And as he was jumping off, the coat got caught in the door that was closing at the time when he was jumping, and it threw him to the ground, and he died right away as he hit the ground. So that was a tragedy that Gilbert had to deal with. And before, or I guess after they left McFarland, another child of theirs, Kaya, who was only 14, died, and but they came back to McFarland to bury her. And after living in River Falls, when Gilbert died, his request was to come back to McFarland to be buried. So all of his family is here, his brothers and his parents and 2 of his children. And this is a photo of the Johnson Scary building, and you can see it's wood framed. And one clue about the age of the photo is down here is a Coca-Cola sign, and so you know it's not. The Coca-Cola came into business about 1886, 1887, and that's when the first Coca-Cola was sent to a restaurant in Atlanta. And I don't know how many years it took for the marketing and delivery of Coca-Cola to Wisconsin, but I'm sure it wasn't the next year or two. So this could be 1890s or even the 19 teens. But that's Gilbert had his shop on the left side. But a number of years after Gilbert and his family left, there was unfortunate thing. On the left side lived Henry Hulverson, and he had the meat market, and on the right side was by the name of Everett Rollis, and he had a grocery store, but his family lived up on the second floor. And Everett Rollis moved in to his business in April of 1924, but in July of 1924, a fire started in Rollis's grocery store, and it destroyed the entire building. And also there was a house on the left side of the building that was also destroyed. And on the right, you can't see it, but there was a building that was there, but is still standing on the corner of Long and Main Streets, just across from the library, across from the Historical Museum. And that was spared because it was built out of concrete blocks. But we're going to come back to this building in a little bit. And I'll just go right next door here. And here we have the Vicks. On this side of the monument, it's Halvor and Johanna Vick, and those are the parents, and they came from Norway. But the person we're going to be talking about is their third child. He was the third out of four child, is Homer Vick Sr. And he was quite the industrious young man. When he was 15, he went and started working at the new McFarland's State Bank. And McFarland's State Bank opened in January of 1905. Homer started working there in 1906, so he was almost on the ground floor. But he was just, a lowly, person to start with. But he stayed at it and kept at it. That he went from just a gopher to doing everything, and then he went to becoming the bookkeeper. And then when he was 20, the cashier at the bank left, and Homer became the cashier. Without any college training, he went straight from school in McFarland to pretty much running the bank by the age of 20. In between there, he was in the military. As you can see on his plaque down here, he is a veteran of World War I, but he never left the country, so he never saw a battle. But he came back after his military service and just resumed where he left off. And then he married Della, who's his wife, and they had a couple of children. And but first of all, in the first years of marriage, they lived in an apartment building, which was a converted school. And the apartment building, see that white building on the corner, and then to the left of that darker building, that's where kind of the school, McFarland's first school was. And when they built the next school on the other side of the tracks, down on Johnson Street, they converted the old school into apartments. And so Homer and Della, being newlyweds, they started their life together, living there. And the story is that Della was home while Homer was at the bank, and Della thought she smelled smoke, and she was a little worried about that. So she called, there was a telephone, so she called the fire department, and which was probably just, I don't think she got the fire department, I think she got the operator, the telephone operator. And she said, "I think I smell smoke." And the operator said, "We don't respond to thinks." And so, And so Della went back, and then she convinced herself, yeah, it is a fire. So she called again. She said, yeah, you better get here. But it was too late. The place burned down. So Homer and Della were out of their home, which was very unfortunate. But they found another place to live, and everything was fine, except the place where they chose to live was the house next to the Johnson Scarry building. And so and then from 1920 to 1924, they were burned out of their home twice. So that's very unfortunate. And at the time of the second fire, they had one child, a baby, Homer Jr. And Homer Jr. is still living. But everything worked out. Homer continued at the bank. They eventually, Della and Homer found another home on Exchange Street, which was where they lived for about 25 years. And then after Homer retired, they moved to a home that they had, a cottage, and they renovated it on Lake Wabeesa. And that's where they stayed until they went to Florida. But Homer, I think, bought his first share of McFarland's State Bank when he was 17. And by 1944, he had purchased enough shares that he had controlling interest in the bank. And so he was on the board of directors. He was the head of the board. And he was just a well-liked person in the community. He founded the McFarland Boy Scouts, and he was the first president of the newly formed McFarland Businessmen's Association in 1941. And in those days, the bank was closed on Thursday afternoons, and so Homer would spend the Thursday afternoons playing croquet with a lot of other businessmen in town. In the 1920s and 30s, that was a very popular sport in McFarland. All right. Now we'll go over here. All right, the next business person we're going to talk about is John Larson. No relation to me, but John is the son of Ole and Brita Larson, and he was born in the town of Dunn, and Ole and Brita were farmers, like a lot of the Norwegian immigrants. And John Larson married Julia Vick, and they had 6 children. And to start out with, early on, John was a farmer, following his dad in the farming business. But as a farmer, he would probably make a lot of visits to the Edwards Brothers farm implement and hardware store on Bashford, the corner of what is now Bashford in Milwaukee. And he got to know E.N. Edwards, one of the brothers who founded that business. And E.N. was somebody who was always on the lookout for a good business deal or doing something new. So he asked his friend John if he would be interested in buying some land down by Lake Wabeesa, because the Knickerbocker Ice Company was selling their land. And John thought, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. He had some money. And so it was John who went down to Chicago and worked the deal out with the Knickerbocker Ice Company. And he came back and he helped E.N. Edwards develop Edwards Park, and on the northern side of that shoreline. And so E.N. built some cottages and whatnot, and John then went a little further south along the shoreline and put up Larson's Beach Resort, and so the two really developed a huge portion of the resort industry in McFarland. Edwards Park and Larson's Beach were major attractions through the whole almost the 20th century. Larson's Beach continued. John Larson ran it, and then after he retired, his son Obed Larson ran it, and then Obed's daughter Jerry Larson and her husband Norman ran it until Jerry died in the early 1970s, and Norman may have stayed there until the 1980s. So it stayed in the Larson family for 80 years, and then Larson's Beach was sold, and it went through a few transitions. One was it Mariners? Not Mariners. Can't remember. But the Beach House was the most recent restaurant there, and before that it was another name, but a restaurant area. And the Beach House people then sold the property, and now what's there is condos, and a not very popular change in McFarland for a lot of the old timers that remember Larson's Beach, and just going there and swimming or boating or fishing or whatever, and that's now a thing of the past. But the other thing that John Larson did, Ian Edwards built a house on the corner of Bashford and Exchange, and he only lived there for a couple of years. Then he sold it to a rich farmer that we spoke about earlier in July, Talif Olson Fossheim, and Talif Olson died after just living there for a few years, and then his wife died, and Talif then moved out to live with a daughter, but it stayed in his name. But then after Talif died in 1910, the estate sold it to John Larson, and the John Larson family owned it until 10 years ago or so, when the McFarland Historical Society bought it. And so now we have the Larson House Museum that John Larson lived in with his family, Julia, his wife, and their children. And during the time when they had Larson's Beach in the 19-teens, the 1920s, the Larson family would spend the summers down in a house they had near Larson's Beach, and they'd rent out the Larson house in town to whoever needed a place. And then when the season ended on the lake, the Larson family would move back to the house in town. Today we think it's just a quick drive from here down to the lake. In those days it was like a long distance. They couldn't afford to take that time to travel back and forth. So they had a residence down on the lake in the summer, and then their house in the winter in town.
Ron, what was Obed's wife's name?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's okay.
No, I think I should have it. Mabel. Yeah. But the interesting thing is that John Larson is Homer Vick's uncle, because of the Julia Vick was John's wife's name, and she was a half sister to Homer's father. We'll test you on that after the. Yes.
What would the Knickerbocker Ice Company be in relation to, say, McDaniel Park?
I don't really know. They would have a warehouse near there because of the tracks, and I think they had a spur track going down towards the water, and they would have cars down there that they could load. But I think it's near the Green Lantern, or
That would be good with the railroad tracks right there.
yeah. Okay, now we're going to go to the Scarry Confectionery Shop.
Serving candy?
Who knows? So I guess we have an employee here from H. Scarry's Confectionery.
Yep.
What are we serving today?
We are serving a hard candy. It costs the same as the chocolate candy, and that would be nothing. So please help yourself. Occasionally I hear some of the stories, like all the time that you're hearing. And when he said that there was a confectionery, I thought, all you good people should have a little treat in the middle of the. So please, I could serve, couldn't I?
Or
Yes.
however you want to.
Yes, I could definitely serve. I'm done, honey.
Okay. And so you might have noticed in this photo, it did say H. Scarry Confectionery on the awning. And so at the time the photo was taken, Henry Scarry had his shop there. And again, I don't know exactly the dates of the people when they worked in this building. But Henry Scarry, once upon a time, had his confectionery in that building. I think at some point Henry Scarry owned the building that his confectionery was in because there was an ad in the State Journal in 1916 that said, for rent, double store building, butcher shop, one side, restaurant on the other side with good living rooms on second floor. Phone or write Henry Scarry, McFarland, Wisconsin. And so we know he owned it, but by the time of the fire, he was not the owner anymore. And among other things, in the late 20s, Henry was the manager of the McFarland Warehouse Association. And I had never really heard of this, but there are a group of businessmen in McFarland that had a warehouse, and they would rent out the space to farmers mostly. And what I believe it was is the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But after Peter Brixton sold the warehouse, I think this cooperative of businessmen bought it and were renting out the space to local farmers. And they did mention tobacco, so I think it was a place for farmers to bring their tobacco and store it until the time was right to sell it. And Henry was born in 1864 in South Dakota. His family must have come from Norway, but for some reason Henry went east from South Dakota to Wisconsin. So I don't know if he was related to the Scarrys that were in McFarland already, or what else would have drawn him here. But the interesting thing is he married a Scarry, and his name is Scarry. So I don't know if they were cousins, second cousins, I don't know. But anyway, they were married, and because right here we have Gertrude and Albert, and we talked about Albert Scarry, the last time, who helped get the museum underway with all of his artifacts. And you would think Henry being right here, he would be a brother, but he wasn't. He was the brother-in-law to Albert. And Corinne is, or Carolyn, I'm sorry, Carolyn is, his wife is back here next to her mother. So there are a lot of mysteries as we start researching these people and why they came here and so on. But that's one of the mysteries, why Henry showed up here and how he's related to the other Scarrys. But Henry and Carolyn built a small-scale Queen Anne house on Exchange Street in 1903. It's still standing. It's still it's looking like it did back in 1903. It's a very nice small Queen Anne house, and they lived there until the day they died. And actually, Henry fell down a flight of stairs in the house and had to be rushed to the hospital. And as a result, according to the papers, he died from lockjaw. And but he had three sons. One died early on, but they had two others. Martin and Raymond. And someone asked me the last time where they're buried, and Martin and Raymond and their wives, Olive and Goldie, are in the upper cemetery. All right, everybody get their candy? You can help yourself, but we're going to be walking further away from here, so now's the time to grab a few pieces. But we have a large monument here that just has the name Anderson on it. There are no other names on any of the sides of the monument, and so that's kind of another mystery of who is this. But luckily the McFarland Cemetery Association has a very good record of the various burial plots, and it tells who's buried where and who is the owner of each plot. And the owner who put this up and owned a lot of these plots here was John Anderson. And he is an interesting story, but he's not buried here. But he owned all of these, about 8 plots. But he grew up in Norway. He lived in Oslo, or Christiania at the time, and he wasn't well off or anything, and he, as a young man or in his teens, he wanted to earn some money because he was desperately wanting to come to America, but he needed the money. So he went and went up north in Norway to learn the logging business, and he was helping on with the fishing boats in the Lofoten Islands. And while he was up there, he met a representative from an American lumber company, and they were looking for young men who could be lumberjacks. And so the deal was they would pay for your transportation to America. You'd come here and you'd get room and board free, and they would pay you something. And so John Anderson thought that was a terrific deal. He could have a chance to come to America. So he did, and he went up north in Wisconsin and near Wausau, and started working in the lumber camps. He was a lumberjack, and he was a very industrious young man, and he knew he had to do more than just chop down trees. So he would work a very long day, and then at night he would go to school to learn English. And he became a quick study of the English language. But he was always meticulous in whatever he did, and especially in his appearance. And he was very neat, and he was very clean. That he wasn't like a rugged lumberjack. He would always look the part of a upstanding young man. And he was a fast learner, and his employers recognized this. And so they thought, okay, you're going places, and we want you to stay in our company. And so they had a connection with the Brittingham and Hickson Lumber Company that was just opening up in McFarland. In 1985, Brittingham and Hickson bought the lumber yard from Freeman Amy, who he and his brother had founded the lumber yard in 1956. But now they are getting out of the lumber business, and Brittingham and Hickson was taking over, and John Anderson was being sent down to help them run the company. And he was an auditor, a bookkeeper, and Brittingham and Hickson was not just in McFarland, but they were all around south central Wisconsin. And so John Anderson would travel around to all of the different sites of Brittingham and Hickson and keep their books and be an accountant. So he was very quick to learn and very good with numbers, and so he was, just the right person. He did meet someone, I'm not sure where, if it was in Wausau or down here, and her name was Louise, and they married. And so they both came to McFarland, or they were both here, and they had 2 sons. One was Helmer, who was born in 1889. But if we look at these grave markers here, here's Louise, and she died in 1889. So I don't know if she died during childbirth of their son Helmer, but then there's another grave here, Frank Anderson, who was born in 1887 and died in 1889, the same year that the mother died. And so was there a disease or something that was going around that claimed both of them? And so John Anderson, had these plots for them. And but he didn't stay single for long. He married again in 1893, and he married Caroline Thompson. And they became McFarland's original power couple. They were really a dynamic couple in McFarland business circles and social circles. In 1905, well, I guess it was 1904, John, with about 4 other men, started the McFarland State Bank. And with his background in bookkeeping and auditing, he was the first president of the McFarland State Bank. And they became very active in both of them in the McFarland Methodist Church, which is very surprising because the Lutheran Church was just across the street. John was from Norway, and all the services in the McFarland Lutheran Church were in Norwegian. So it just seemed natural that he would go there. But maybe Carolyn persuaded him to become Methodist. That has happened once in a while, I think. Yeah. But there are other graves here, Alfred, Amelia, and some other Thompsons, and those are family of Carolyn. And so her family is buried here. And in the early days of this cemetery, if you weren't Lutheran, if you weren't a member of the Lutheran Church, you probably weren't going to be buried here. But I'm guessing the Thompsons were members, and so they were buried here. And so maybe, I don't know what there's another mystery. What happened to John Anderson? Why he was a strong member of the Methodist Church? I don't know. But John Anderson is not buried here, and his wife is not buried here, because probably not being members of the Lutheran Church. But anyway, they had one of their daughters was named Adelaide, and she married an Adams. So her name was Adelaide Adams. And if you're ever in the McFarland Public Library, you'll see her name next to the local history room. Because when she died, she left in her will $25,000 for the McFarland Historical Society to use however they want. And then when the McFarland Library is built, the Historical Society thought, well, we could give this money towards the library and have a history room. And so that's the story behind that. It was Adelaide Adams, who's Caroline, and John Anderson's daughter.
Where did the Methodists get buried?
Well, the Methodist Church was here from 1880 something until the 1930s, and the upper cemetery, up Broadhead, has the Methodists in there, and some people have referred to it as the Methodist Cemetery. But when they disbanded in the 1930s, the Lutherans took it over. Okay, we're just going to briefly say over here, Ted Thompson, Theodore Thompson. He was born in McFarland. His parents were Elsie and Steiner Thompson. They were farmers. But you don't even have to sit down, because I'm just going to say he sang in the church choir. He was a huge singer, just loved to sing. He was president of different organizations in the church, the Luther Men's Club, and he was the president of the choir, and he was the treasurer of the McFarland School Board. But the main thing about Ted was he was a hardware man for 40 years in downtown McFarland. The Ole S. Olson building, most of you know it as the old antique shop on Main Street. Now it's a Lakeside Property or something, developer. But that's where Ted Thompson was for 40 years. Well, we have a large monument here. It says Brixton, and again, there aren't any other names on it, so you just have to know. And here we have two headstones that just say Peter and Ida. Well, they were Brixtons, and Peter Brixton was another well-to-do farmer in the McFarland area, had farms out in Pleasant Springs. But he, along with John Anderson, were the go-getters in town in terms of business. And Peter Brixton was another founding member of the McFarland State Bank. But Peter was also a tobacco merchant. He grew tobacco, but then he also stored it for farmers and sold it to the tobacco companies. And he was quite wealthy. At the time of his death in 1920, his estate was worth $164,000. And so in 1920, that's quite a bit of money. But he owned several farms, as I said, and if you saw Peter get into his wagon or buggy in town, he had a house on Main Street, and you asked him, where are you going? He said, I'm going to go survey my farms. He just liked to go out on a Sunday drive to look at his fields. But he had this warehouse, the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse, which was over by the tracks, between the tracks and Creamy Road, right across from the Conrad Albion School. And but this gives you a better idea and context where it is. This is the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse. This is the Edwards Brothers building. That building's still standing on Bashford Street, but it's white now and it's an apartment. And the lumber yard is back here. So the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse was just across the tracks from the lumber yard. But in 1931, Peter Brixton's daughter, their only child, Elizabeth, donated $1,250 to the McFarland Lutheran Church in memory of her parents. And the church used that money to install their stained glass windows. And here's a picture of a stained glass window in the church. But when you look at a larger picture of the church from the outside, there were a lot of stained glass windows. Every side had these large windows and two smaller ones. And so on three sides for sure, these massive windows. I can't imagine that entire gift of $1,250, even in 1931 or 32, took care of all that. But the church used that money to help them maybe put over the top with their budget to put in these nice windows. So for a lot of us who grew up in that church, it's hard to imagine that church without the stained glass windows, but for 30 some years, that church was there with just regular glass windows. And it wasn't until the mid-30s where they had the stained glass. All right, well, we'll keep going. Try to get you out of here by 8. And just going over here a little bit. I have to give a plug for our walking tour in 2 weeks. That one is on the musicians and writers of McFarland. And I mentioned Ted Thompson and what a lovely voice he had, but in that walking tour we're going to be talking about his mother, Elsie Thompson, and she's a story you don't want to miss. And here we have Osmond Olson, Osmond T. Olson, but he was best known as O.T. Olson, and he was the depot agent in McFarland. And he was the one who succeeded William McFarland as the primary depot agent. In all of McFarland's history, there have been 3 primary depot agents: William McFarland, O.T. Olson, and Burley Allen. And Burley Allen took the job up until the depot was gone in 1963. But O.T. Olson, being a depot agent, you wouldn't think he was at the same level as maybe Peter Brixton or John Anderson, but O.T. Olson was also one of the founding members of the McFarland State Bank. So he had some power in town as a businessman, as the depot agent. But the interesting thing on this grave is that on this tombstone, over here it says brother 1849 to 1865, and then on this side it says father 1822 to 1852. Well, that's written on the tombstone, but they're not buried here because in 1865 there wasn't a cemetery here, and so the brother had to be buried somewhere else. In 1852 there wasn't even a McFarland here, and so no one would have been buried here. So the family of O.T. Olson wanted to recognize people in their family who had died previously and put their names on the monument as well. But 1852 is not the date of someone being buried here. This cemetery was, well, the church was here first, and it started building in 1867, and it wasn't completed until the early 1870s. And so the earliest graves that we have here, I think, are around 1870, 1871. But so it doesn't go back that far. And then just on the other side, there's a small monument for Esther Nelson and Peter Nelson. And Peter Nelson is better known to longtime McFarland residents or people who've studied McFarland history or read the McFarland history book. He's best known as Shoemaker Pete. and he had a little shop on Main Street that he worked there for 49 years. Repairing shoes, making shoes, and helping the people of McFarland walk around. And then when he retired, the Capital Times stated that this community will miss one of its most faithful servants. And he retired in 1918, and so he had been working as a shoemaker in McFarland since 1869. But the interesting thing is his wife Esther is a sister to O.T. Olson.
Can you explain what a depot agent is? Is that train depot?
Yeah, the railroad station. They would be the telegraph operator and get the mail in and out, and all the shipping. The people would bring in things that would have to be shipped out, or he'd receive all the cargo that would come in to the depot that day. And McFarland was, they were receiving large items, like just down the track would be the Edwards brothers, and they would be getting plows and all sorts of hardware in that the depot agent would help with all that, getting it off the train or onto the train, and livestock. All right, I'm not going to take the time to go over to the Ausins. I'll just say right here, that big black monolith there, another large headstone. It says Austin on the other side, and I can't remember the name on the other side, but it's the brother to the person I want to talk about, Thomas Austin, Thomas and Tilla. Their names aren't on there, but Thomas's brother is on there, and I don't know what Thomas's brother did, but he died before Thomas, so Thomas must have put that monolith up in honor of his brother. But Thomas and Tilla have two small headstones right there that just say Thomas and Tilla on it, and their parents are that white, grayish, tall one right between the two, and the name is Aasen, A-A-S-E-N, and the sons changed it to A-U-S-E-N. But Thomas Aasen worked for the Edwards brothers at their hardware an implement store on Bashford. And Tilla, his wife, was the sister to E.N. and Theodore. So he had an inn with the family to get a job there. And so he was their livestock and feed person in the business. But he saw a need, and so he helped start the feed mill in McFarland, which was just where, it's along the tracks where Arnold Larson Park is located now. And that's where farmers would bring their grain in to be crushed and milled from 1900 up until about 1970 or the late 60s. So that's just a quick word about the Austins. And right behind me is headstone J.S. Johnson, and he was he grew up in McFarland. His dad was Sher Johnson, a farmer on the south side of town, farm overlooked Lower Mud Lake. But J.S. decided not to be a farmer, and he wanted to be a businessman. So in the 1880s, late 1880s, he had a store, and it was a wood frame building, and it was a general store. And then in 1897, I believe, he built his store, which is on the corner of Main and I guess Lexington, across from the tavern, across the side street, but it's where the library is located now. It's on that corner. And so he was in business for many, many years, probably 40 years in that location. And it remained a grocery store after he died, and until about 1964. And then it was torn down in 1967 to make room for the McFarland State Bank. And then the bank was torn down to make room for the McFarland Public Library. And just some more about J.S. Johnson. Like a lot of other business people, he was involved in politics, and he was the clerk for the town of Dunn for many years. And he was an active member in the McFarland Lutheran Church. He married Louisa Lewis in 1902, but she died 2 years later. And then J.S. married Louisa's sister, Sarah, and they had one son, Seifert, who continued in the business with his dad, J.S. All right, now we're just going to walk over towards those pine trees. Well, here we are standing, and there are no headstones in this green spot with a little dip to it. But there are 5 graves here without headstones. And one of them belongs to J. Edward Reed, who lived from 1870 until 1957. And he was a carpenter and a contractor in the McFarland area. But he was born in Iowa and came to McFarland around 1890. And he married a local woman, Elinda Vinge. But they didn't have any children. But Elinda Vinge's parents, Anders and Anna Vinge, are also buried here, but with no headstone, and Elinda's sister, Hannah. So they're here, but for some reason they didn't have a headstone, if they couldn't afford it, or they just didn't want to be remembered in any way. But J. Edward was, as I said, a carpenter, and he built a couple buildings. One is this building that I mentioned before. It was on the side of the Johnson-Scarry building that burned, and a lot of you who grew up here will remember it as Larry's Pharmacy. There was also Kathy's upholstery shop there, but for many years it was a grocery store, a general store. But J. Edward Reed built this, and he built another building across the side street from it, which we had talked about earlier. It was the Thompson Autumn Garage. And you can see it in the distance there. It's where the library stands now, but it's where they had the garage for fixing cars and the Ford dealership. And so Edward Reed built that around 1916. But J. Edward Reed was not a Norwegian, and so somehow he got buried here. Maybe that's why there's no headstone. They wouldn't allow a headstone. But he married a Norwegian, so that I think that was his inn, the Vinji, and so he's one of the few non-Norwegians that you'll find here that died prior to 1960. And we just have one more stop, and then we'll be done. All right. Well, we're going to end with Tolliff Lewis, and he's here with his wife Julia, and they lived on grew up in the McFarland area, and their parents were farmers, and Tolliff then became a farmer, and his farm was on the south side of the village. It abutted the Sher Johnson farm. If you go down Exchange Street, you'll still see the farmhouse, but it's been remodeled. It's on the corner of Lewis and Exchange, and all the farmland to the south of that, towards Mud Lake, was the Tolliff Lewis farm. And he kind of grew tired of farming, and he wanted to go into business. And so he started a business in downtown McFarland in the Tolliff Lewis building that he had built for his furniture shop, barber shop, and undertaking business. He had all three going. And furniture business on the first floor, the undertaking business on the upper floor, and the barber shop in the back. But he was doing that for 38 years, and when he retired, he was Wisconsin's longest serving undertaker when he died in 1938. But when he died, all the businesses were closed in town from 1 o'clock until 3 in honor of his funeral. But one of his sons was Theodore Lewis, and some of you know that story, where he went to World War I, saw some action, was gassed, but came home and went to law school, and then started really rising through the ranks, where he was the Madison City Attorney for a time. He was the Dane County District Attorney for a time, and he was the main assistant for a while for the Mayor Schmiedemann of Madison, and then Mayor Schmiedemann ran for governor and won. And he really liked Theodore Lewis. He knew what type of work he could do and what kind of upstanding man he was. So he had Theodore come and be his primary assistant in the governor's office. And Schmiedemann only served for one term, so he wasn't there in the governor's office for very long, but there was a vacancy in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And so Governor Schmiedemann didn't look very far, and he saw his assistant, Theodore Lewis, with a law degree and knew a lot, so he appointed Theodore Lewis to fill that position on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And that was in 1934. He was appointed November 15th, 1934, but unfortunately Theodore Lewis died 20 days later without ever hearing a case. But he's still listed in the official Wisconsin Supreme Court list of justices as being a member. And so McFarland has one of its own sons as a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice. No, pneumonia. He died from pneumonia. Because of complications from being gassed in World War I, his lungs weren't that strong, and so he died of pneumonia. It's very unfortunate. But here's the headline in the State Journal from the time Theodore Lewis died. But he grew up just down the street and played in the area of down along Lewis Road and in that area, probably in the woods, where what we call now Indian Mountain Woods. He would run up there, I'm sure. So somebody, areas that we know very well, Theodore Lewis lived and played. McFarland had a lot of businesses for a little town and a lot of interesting people, but I'm sure every little town can have the same stories, but because this is our town, they're special, and there are many people that I didn't mention because they're not buried here, they don't have family here, like the Edwards brothers or the Amy brothers or Frank Siegelco or so many more that aren't getting mentioned. So this is just a snapshot of McFarland's early business community. But thank you for coming.
Thank you.